From the shadows of the coven to the lips of the living, VE Cosmetics conjures up a beauty so good, it must be witchcraft. Vegan and cruelty-free for those who walk between the worlds. VE Cosmetics. Grab a discount with my affiliate code BELLWITCH at the checkout. BELLWITCH, all one word, for a 10% discount on your entire order. And a little tip for this witch. Now then, witches and beautiful souls, welcome to another episode of the Bell Witch Podcast, a witchcraft podcast that talks about being magic and spiritual in the 21st century. This episode is a delightful Moot Loot episode with a fabulous guest, Nicholas Pearson, who is an author of a wide range of spirituality books based around witchcraft, herbalism and gemstones, and is a brilliant guest with fountains of knowledge about gemstone geology and how things are made in the earth, how that may increase their magical potential. It is such an awesome interview and there's tons of information in it. It is definitely one you're going to want to re-listen to. It is an episode celebrating his new book, The Witching Stones, which I actually have a copy of, and it is a really good book, quite different from any of my other gemstone books that I own. Whilst editing this episode, I was thinking that many of us don't actually think about where stuff comes from and how things are formed or created naturally below earth or on mountains, and how that process may influence and enhance magical abilities of the items we use in our witchcraft. How that magic is infused within the gemstone, and also what even is a gemstone, you know, like sparkly, shiny, or the basic flint all around the UK. To my delight, Nicholas does talk about the Yorkshire coast in terms of geology, can't even say it, and gemstone and jet and all that lovely stuff. Yorkshire people, as you know, are obsessed with Yorkshire. And this episode was recorded some time ago in November. I know, I'm so slow. I need to get faster. So thank you, Nicholas, for your patience on waiting for this episode. I really appreciate it. This month has been about The Wizard of Oz. For my kids' production at school, I like this because witches. And it was handy to have a witchy mum to lend items for props, say no more. My broomstick is centre stage, which I quite love. Imagine all that magic working for the show. Proud mum alert. Oh, she's soppy. My little Flossie is Auntie M, and forgive me while I quickly blow her trumpet. She has been so out of her comfort zone. She's quite shy. She's been standing in for other roles as she's the female understudy, and I'm just immensely proud of her, and I just wanted to say that on the air. I know it's a bit soppy and a bit mushy, but it's just magic to see your little shy children talk and act to a room full of people on the stage dressed up as a character. It's no easy task. I don't think I could even do it, so I just want to big her up. Anyway, that's enough from me. Grab a gemstone or a crystal that you may have nearby and let's dive in. Our guest today is an author, a healer, a gemstone genius, and fossil fanatic. With extensive knowledge on stones of ancient lands and owns a very impressive crystal collection. From all the way across the pond in Florida, may I introduce and welcome Nicholas Pearson to the Bell Witch podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
We're on today to celebrate you and your new book, which is amazing and I just cannot put down. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this line of work?
Yeah, I think I'm a stereotype in a lot of ways. I picked up rocks everywhere I went as a kid. If it was shiny, if it was smooth, if it had the right pattern on it, if it just spoke to me, it would be tucked away in a pocket or my backpack or anywhere I could squirrel it away, which meant a lot of rocks went through the wash. And sometimes they still do. Some things never change. But I initially just had this magnetic draw towards stone. And at some point in my early childhood, my grandfather gave me a proper mineral specimen. It was my first piece of quartz. And in very simple terms, that rock changed my life. All of a sudden, stone wasn't just this inert part of the landscape. It was something regular and angular and transparent and something enigmatic, like it had come straight from the pages of a fairy tale or a storybook, and I had to know more. So I spent a lot of time in the local library as a child. Other families did church on weekends. My family did the library on weekends. One week it might be learning about rocks and minerals or marine biology or whatever else I could sink my teeth into that was age appropriate. And then the next week it might be the Greek myths or ancient Egyptian culture. And I just grew up with this kind of parallel love of both science and natural history and mythology, spirituality, folklore, magic. And it was probably around my early teens that I fell into a book about crystal healing. And all of a sudden, this practice I'd read about as a folkloric and historic thing, it wasn't just in the past. It was a living, breathing, present tense kind of practice that people still engaged with. And I had to know more. I approach everything that I do with both sides of my brain. I want to have the raw, empirical, personal, spiritual gnosis about it and do all the mystical and the woo-woo. But then I also want to sit back and learn about the geology and the history and sometimes the linguistics of how rocks get their names, because all of this comes together to paint a pretty holistic picture of who they are and what they're here to do with us. So I've been following that thread ever since. I started teaching workshops on it real young, more than 20 years ago now.
What was the book that you found that introduced you to it all?
So I think probably my very first book on crystals as a modern practice was written by Ken and Jules Taylor, and it is appropriately called Crystals. Shortly after that, I found the works of Sue and Simon Lilly, who are magnificent humans, and they also have science backgrounds. I've since become friendly with them over the years. Don't chat as often as we used to, but I mean, she's just brilliant. I've done some training with them, and I started out with a lot of those very classic books of the 90s and the early aughts, and then, as you can see behind me, there are a lot of books.
We're just admiring your bookshelves.
These are my crystal books on this side of the room. I can't pan the camera any further, but if I could, you could see it goes back quite a ways for all the other topics. But I love books. I love rocks. So books about rocks are like my happy place. So I've got it all from geology and geochemistry to ethnogeology, and then, of course, the folklore, the mythology, and lots of the metaphysics on crystals. And I love weaving it all together.
So we'll come on to talk about your amazing book. You've done a book before, is that correct?
This one is my 10th book.
Oh, wow. Oh, my God. So I apologise. I thought there were one other. They're all about crystals, are they?
The majority, yeah. So I started with my first book. I had a corporate life. I've done a lot of things in my life. I've worked in the earth science field, which I do again now. And I eventually kind of put all my stuff into storage. after leaving school and thought I was going to immigrate to Japan and just do that for a while. Turns out I didn't. I went there for a few weeks and came back home and eventually had to do something with my life. So I started working in the tea industry, the retail end of it, doing luxury retail tea. And at the kind of pinnacle of my career, when everything was going swimmingly, I started writing. I had a little piece of obsidian in my pocket, and it was pretty standard for me to, we'll say, pick a gemstone ally or a crystal guide or teacher that was just going to be present with me all day. A habit I've had for many, many, many years of my life, but I was really in the groove of my practice at this point because I won't say work was on autopilot, but it was going better than expected. And I was able to, kind of let the inertia take it. So I was devoting a lot more of my mental, emotional, and spiritual bandwidth to other stuff. And I just remember this day that I was driving to work. I didn't even make it out of the car park in my apartment complex. And I had this idea that just fell into my head about how pretty much no matter where you go in the world, people use obsidian for similar things. Sharp stuff and shiny stuff, if we can be really prosaic about it. And that those material uses echo the spiritual values of obsidian. And so I kind of let this idea gnaw at me for a week or so before I eventually put pen to paper and just miraculously turned out a chapter. I'd tried writing off and on for a really long time and it had never really taken hold. But this project was just so effortless to get started. Maybe not to finish, but to get started. And one thing led to another. Within a few months, we had a corporate buyout. My job was no longer bringing me like a speck of joy, not one tiny bit. I'd had a long-standing offer to be a sales rep in the body, mind, spirit field. So I kind of took that leap of faith. It did not go well, but it did bring me some really magical stuff. And it was actually Halloween weekend, Samhain weekend, 2014. I was doing a trade show with this temporary gig, and I was chatting up a publisher about life in general, how slow the show was. I managed to work in that I was writing a book, and one thing led to another, and I submitted to them, and that was how my first book was born, a decade ago now when it came out. And that was such a magical experience. And in many ways, that first book, The 7 Archetypal Stones, is kind of like the spiritual ancestor of the witching stones. In a similar fashion, it goes really in depth into a single stone at a time and goes through these kind of 7 very alchemical allies. And it's a little bit more mystical and less magical, if that makes sense. Whereas the Witching Stones is the opposite. It's getting that first book finally done. It took me about a year and a half to really put it all together. And once I did, I just have kept writing ever since. Most of my books, out of the 10 currently in print, 8 of them are about things related to crystals of varying topics under that umbrella. From, pocket-sized encyclopedias to big textbooks. And then I've also got a work on the practice of Reiki, of Usui Reiki Ryoho, and then one on flower essences called Flower Essences from the Witch's Garden. That was my first pandemic baby, and also my first book to have the word witch in the title and kind of lead with that identity for a bit. And all of that really paves the way for the Witching Stones in a lot of ways, because I just felt like I needed a project where I could go deep into the lore and the geology and have the space on the page to really tell the whole story of a rock, because it's great to write a little pocket encyclopedia. People love that. It is useful. It is portable. Compared to some of my other books, that's also a really welcome thing. When you have this much room to tell someone about emerald, what are you leaving out? As opposed to this, where you've got like this much room to talk about emerald. And I'd been so invested in my kind of personal magical studies. I can't do the same thing all of the time, which is why very few of my books on rocks are just a basic, here is how you do something with rocks. It's got to be, here's how we specialize in this way, or here's how these myths unite these things. So I've been doing a lot of, say, more occult study and practice in my life, particularly with plants. And I found this really lovely book called The Witching Herbs by Harold Roth, and it's published by Wiser Books. And I just enjoyed it. He's such a great storyteller. It's got 13 chapters with 13 plants in it. And when push came to shove, and I was really coming up with the idea for this book, The Witching Stones, I won't say that I used Harold's as my prototype, but it certainly is really good proof of concept that the witchy world would let me do this, would hopefully eat it up, and that there might be an opportunity to pitch it to a publisher. So I was chatting to actually his editor, which I didn't know at the time, about this new idea that I had. And I thought it would be a really good Wiser book because Wiser had something similar about plants. And do you think you might be interested? And of course, the answer was a resounding yes. And I had to get through another project first, but I did eventually do that so I could sit down and write The Witching Stones. And I just had so much fun working on this book, from the research, going through academic journals and scholarly papers and peer-reviewed stuff, as well as books on folklore and myth and magic and geology and witchcraft, and weaving all that stuff together to actually like engaging with the practice. So the book has these 13 chapters on 13-ish, it's really more, stones. And then there's like more than 50 spells and rituals and remedies and recipes that are peppered throughout. So I did all of those things. I engaged all of those practices. Some are like clearly rooted in history. It's a simple bit of folk magic that I've maybe reworked for the modern era. And other stuff is like my own invention based on that folklore. So all of that got to come together, and I'm just so excited to see it going out into the world.
It is a gorgeous book. I'm very impressed with the amount of chapters and the way it's set out, and it's quite easy to consume as a witch because there's so many books out there, that are all very similar. It's all pretty stones, and when I read this, and it was like, oh my god, there's flint and there's salt, and they're all the stones that don't get a look in, and that's amazing to me.
Yeah, it was really important when I was dreaming this book up that I highlight things that get left behind. There is so much magic in the earth. It is very easy to be enchanted by a shiny new piece of selenite, a gorgeous emerald or ruby, a fine and perfect polished quartz sphere. But there's the same amount of magic, maybe more, in that humble piece of slate or chalk or flint or a hagstone you find on the pebble beach. And it's easy to get distracted by the superficial magic of a beautiful piece of amethyst. There is deep magic in it as well, but because it is so beautiful, sometimes we linger only on that layer of what it is. And so the Witching Stones introduces us to a lot of materials, we'll say, because they're not all proper stones, although they all have geologic origins. But it introduces us to materials that are both humble and noble, and also to remind people that there's magic in the earth everywhere. You don't have to go buy that, $700 piece of moldavite. You can, if it's not a burden for you to do so, and you want to work with it, and you find that a fair price, do that. But also that piece of flint that you found in the backyard, the same amount of magic is available to you in that flint, if only you know how to see it. That was really the litmus test for whether something could make it into the book.
I've got a piece of flint with me here. Don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
I love it. And it's got like a little thumb imprint that I liked it. And I've had it on me for years. And I'm pretty sure it's flint. I mean, I'm not an expert. But like you say, the stones that come to you when you're not looking, I think, are stones to treasure. And this was one of them. And my kids are obsessed with getting stones and bringing them home. And I encourage it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a piece of flint right here that I got the first time I went to London. This was from the Thames. So, at low tide, you can go down and do some mudlarking. And it was our first day in London. And I can't tell you how much flint I picked up that day. Most of it I gave away. I did not keep it. But this was one of my favorite pieces because it's roughly in the shape of an arrowhead. I'm sure it's just a natural cobble that got, broken down. But all the sharp edges have been tumbled smooth, like they've been sanded down from all the other rocks in the river, and it's just got a great feeling to it. The texture is so lovely, and just to imagine the history that it has seen, that there are Roman artifacts just floating around.
I know, yeah,
just amazing.
Would you say it's quite an underrated stone?
For sure. If we think about it, Over the course of human history, and not just like human as in us and recorded history, but hominids, our ancestors before Homo sapiens, flint, in no uncertain terms, is one of the most important materials. Flint mining and flint knapping are the first industries ever. And there's theories that they predate anatomically modern humans as well. We suspect the earliest use of flint tools may be as far back as 1.5 million years ago.
Wow.
And it's challenging to put an exact timeline on that because the earliest flint tools weren't shaped by human hands, they were found by human hands. So you found something that had a sharp edge that you could cut with, or a round surface that you could hammer with, or a good strong corner that you could scrape with, and you used that as a tool. So we have to find evidence of the right kind of wear and tear that suggests practical uses of otherwise normal, natural looking flint nodules. And over time, that develops into the art of flint knapping, of making scrapers and hand axes and arrowheads and projectile points and knives. And flint shapes human history, just as humans shape flint. And there is so much deep magic to be found in its formation process, which was not very well understood until fairly recent years. And we've since got a much more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of how flint formed. We usually find flints in these kind of strata, these really distinct layers in beds of chalk or other kind of calcite-rich, carbonate-rich rocks. And one of the prevailing theories is that in the ancient shallow tropical seas, the silica-rich organisms like sponges, they have these little tiny hair-like structures called spicules that are made out of almost pure silica, that as the waters dried out and what would become chalk is kind of thrust out into the open, we get rainwater and such percolating through this, gathering up and dissolving as much of that silica as possible and depositing it in these distinct layers. But one of like the big glaring problems with this theory is that the sea would have to rise and fall so many times to add a new layer of chalk and a new layer of flint and then a new layer of chalk. And like, there's just no evidence that's actually what happened with the ancient water levels. And now the new theory is so much more fascinating to me, and it involves the wobble in the Earth's orbit. So, we've got this imaginary pole that runs north to south, and it points approximately towards Polaris, the North Star, currently. But it tilts and has a slight wobble. And so this causes these very long expanses of time called Milankovitch cycles. They take forever to go through. And during certain periods of these Milankovitch cycles, because of the way we tilt, we receive either more or less sunlight, kind of like we do in the seasons, between here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're in the cooler season, there's less sunlight, and other half of the year we're in the warmer season. But imagine that on a big cosmic scale. So it's a subtle shift compared to our annual one, but it is a really important one because it causes blooms in certain kinds of microorganisms in the ancient sea. And it also changes what's happening in the sediment at the bottom. And at the perfect depth where the aerobic and anaerobic respiration meets, you go deep enough into the primordial goo or sludge that was in the bottom of these tropical seas, and there's not enough oxygen for certain kinds of microbes to exist. And so others that don't require oxygen are there. But at the place where the oxygen-rich and the oxygen-deficient environments meet, the byproducts of their cellular respiration, of their existence, comes together and creates the perfect environment for flint to form. And because we've got these cycles where the calcium-rich stuff blooms in profusion and then dies off, it creates those beds of chalk in distinct layers. And then at a given depth, that's where we get the flint to form. So flint forms at like the meeting space between the here and now and the great beyond. And then as far as human history goes, people have dug into the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, often choosing to dig at places less convenient than we could find it on the surface. And we often see, like, for example, in Grimes graves in Norfolk, there's really great evidence of Neolithic flint mining there, where people would descend something like 10, 20 meters down. And so they would recover this holy stone from the underworld itself and bring it back and use it not just for mundane uses, but also for ritual purposes, as if rather than get the flint on the surface that's easy and everywhere, somehow descending into this liminal space brought back that liminal quality with it. And flint becomes this way shower, this door opener, this portal between here and beyond. And it carries with it echoes of the way it forms in this in-between space and is recovered from a different kind of in-between environment, and then is used in the in-betweenness that is witchcraft, that is magic. And I think once we learn to appreciate its geology, its interaction with humans, as well as the folklore we often hear in witchy spaces, we see that they aren't identical, but I sometimes describe it as it's as if they rhyme. The formation process rhymes with its Neolithic use, rhymes with our 19th and 20th century folklore. And they're all connected in this continuous thread. And that thread is the intelligence or the spirit of flint itself. And somehow the way humans interact with it is always guided by this intelligence. And you can go just about anywhere in the world, and flint artifacts are treated very similarly, are regarded as being products of similar supernatural phenomena. And that's fascinating that we've got cultures who don't mingle, who didn't share ideas, who theoretically distantly branched off from one another long before we used flint tools, probably. So, these are ideas that arose independently, convergently throughout the expanse of time itself.
I must admit, I feel a bit guilty of not really thinking too deeply about stones and how they come to be and how they're in our magic and stuff. And that story of flint demands respect. It demands care and attention. I'm so impressed.
And just think, if we can find that kind of deep magic in flint, we can find it in anything. If we can learn to view flint as a precious substance, then the whole earth comes alive. The entire planet becomes inspirited. And also, here's one of the subversive goals of the book. I think anyone who reads between the lines not too carefully kind of gets this, but if that magic exists in flint, doesn't it also exist in us? With the amount of agency and power that we have, can't we enact the same alchemy and transformation? The witching stones hinge on this human mineral relationship. It is relational because we come together. We are the magic as well. And so looking at 1.5 million years of human flint history, that's powerful to me.
Hey, what you doing right now? Besides listening to a rather awesome podcast, might I add. Well, while you're here, do you fancy just opening up the app in which you're listening to this podcast on and putting some stars in for that little podcast which is independently made, with no backing or large funding bodies? Perhaps writing a quick review saying, "This is awesome." Blush. In all honesty, those stars mean a lot to podcasters like myself, and they really do help us to grow and increase our reach as a podcast episode. It is a labour of love, and we all are addicted to creating content for you right now to enjoy and be thoroughly entertained. It's magic, as those stars really do help the show to shine. So if you don't mind and your thumbs are not too tired, please leave a rating and review. You legend. Okay, thanks for that. I shall leave you be to enjoy the episode. In the book, that flint is the first stone that you talk about, and then it's followed by, is it a hagstone?
Yeah, I love hagstones. I've got one of my favorites right here.
Oh, there we go. Yep, this is my hagstone.
Oh, wonderful.
Got fairy stones.
I love it. The kind of early part of the book deals with stones that are, we'll say, maybe a little less refined in character. They're not our precious and semi-precious gems by modern standards, but they are definitely rocks that I associate with witchcraft and magic. And what better example of that than hagstone? Even our like super serious occultists and the trad crafters that have skulls on every horizontal surface and turn their nose up at crystals, you're going to find a hagstone in their pocket or around their neck or hanging from their stang. So I wanted to start with these stones that I think are like common currency in witchcraft and magic. They are materials that are really easy to find folklore about. And hagstone is kind of a special case because it's not a kind of material. It is the result of one of several processes. And so it is the shape, the form, the history that defines a hagstone rather than what it's made out of. Now, depending on where you live in the world, what it's made out of could be fairly uniform. I mean, you go through many parts of Great Britain, for example, and you're going to find predominantly flint hagstones. But because flint is so ubiquitous and because of how it is so easily eroded out of chalk and then transported, it's likely to experience those erosive forces that generate that hole, that perforate the stone. Where I live, you're going to find lots of kind of flattened pieces of calcareous rocks, sandstone and coquina and limestone rather, and coquina and similar kinds of materials, because that's what we've got. And so the magic of my hagstone isn't really different to the magic of your hagstone because they've lived the same process. They've been worn down by the passage of time, by the movement of wind and sediment and pebble and sometimes of mollusk. And it is almost what they are missing that makes them magical. It is the fact that they have had something subtracted and it pierces all the way through. And, proverbially, it's like piercing the veil, crossing the hedge, entering into that ecstatic state. Hagstones teach us how to empty ourselves of our attachment, our expectation, our baggage, our fear, so we can go into that state of consciousness where we more readily commune with the spirits, the ancestors, the gods themselves, and they become portals of magic. And so they were really easy to include in the book. Finding their exact placement was also pretty easy. If I knew I was starting with flint, hagstone comes next. It's just kind of natural because if you take that flint and you grind it down, it becomes a hagstone. But then it's kind of the rest of the book that is the curious arc of trying to figure out exactly what goes where. And so I followed those two stones with some fossils that are pretty widespread and pretty easy to encounter. We've got ammonites, also known as snake stones. I've got here an ammonite fossil from Yorkshire.
Is it from Yorkshire?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Amazing.
So, there's some brilliant folklore about them. After that come the echinoids, which go by a million names. So I've got one here from South Carolina, but I used to pick these up along the Gulf Coast beaches when we go visit some distant family. I have just a few of these little treasures that I've maintained over the years from my childhood, and they've got this little 5-pointed star on them. And, they're sometimes known as pixie heads and fairy loaves, and they've got so many colorful names, shepherd loaves and
sneeze.
Yeah, they all kind of point to the folklore behind them, and they're just so charming. But after this, there's this kind of turning point, I think, in the book. We start to go from ordinary rocks to things that are maybe of more industrial use, things that certainly are magical and have long magical histories, but we experience them in everyday life a little bit differently. So this is stuff like salt and lodestone or magnetite, the origin of our magnets, and lead, which also is kind of the prototype of metals generally, because lead is, by all accounts, the first metal that humans refine from their ores. We go from there into what I think are probably the higher magic kind of stones, the things that are some very ancient and some surprisingly less so in terms of what we identify by those names, at least. So we've got toadstone, one last fossil, but also it describes something that never really existed. So it's kind of pseudo-mythological, and there are a few different things one might work with. We've got amber and jet in a single chapter. We have our cross stones, which are two different species, staurolite and chiastolite. And then we've got quartz and moonstone and emerald. In this kind of last three are the proper precious or semi-precious gems by modern standards. It kind of becomes this through line from the really ordinary parts of the landscape to parts of the landscape that have unusual features to things that we use in everyday life and kind of forget their geological origins. How many of us, when opening up the fridge, stop and think about how those magnets are refined from ores? We don't. And, kind of continuing this arc where we go from ultimately humble Flint, literally a fire starter and torchbearer, to emerald, which embodies this kind of Luciferian principle of bringing light into darkness and consciousness into matter and spirit into the ordinary. And they're almost like two octaves of the same concept. And then we go through these different chapters between that help us refine that concept further. And, ultimately, both of those stones are about igniting this magic within us. So we see, like, for example, one of the rituals in the chapter on Flint is igniting the witch fire. Yeah, I mean, I could sit here and tell stories of these rocks.
I know. I do really like the layout. It really appeals to me, and I can really get a grand sense of starting with the Flint and ending with the emerald. I really like that in this book. This is a bit of a controversial question in the grand scheme of all the crystals. What would you say is overrated, if any?
Well, I have a really long list, actually. Let's start with big picture. Two things can be true at the same time. Something can be really hyped up and projected as larger than life and be made to feel unattainable, uncomfortable, and unrealistic. And it can also still be the right stone for you. If I list something as being overhyped or overrated, it doesn't make it a bad rock. It just means that maybe the average person's experience does not align with what social media is kind of painting a picture of. And I'm going to pick some really low-hanging fruit here. This is super easy thanks to post TikTok world. I'm going to talk about moldavite.
I knew you were going to say that.
And let me preface this by saying I love moldavite. I've worn it for many years of my life as a kind of daily stone. I got my first piece of it when I was about 13, 14 or so.
Oh, wow.
So, I've worked with it for, I won't say how many years, but a lot of them, a whole lot.
Yeah.
I'm way older than 13. It is a magical stone. But in this kind of early TikTok era, when it went viral, people were attributing a lot of life circumstances and happenings to moldavite that it surely couldn't be responsible for. And so it kind of picked up this inertia that I'd never seen before. We see probably the early beginnings of the moldavite craze in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s. Again, there's like a big wave of it in maybe the mid 2000s. Those do not compare to what happened in 2020. And then combined with everything else happening in the world, people were looking for the magic pill that was going to fix their life. People were looking for a way to re-enchant the world. They also felt really powerless. They didn't have agency because we were restricted in what we could do and where we could go and maybe who we wanted to go anywhere with, as people made their voices known in some ways that were kind of unsettling at best. And the allure of something that could be this magic bullet to fix everything was attractive. But, the truth is that we start to get people linking events that correlate in the fact that they happen sequentially, but are unrelated because they have no causality. I think we're going on 9 years in the spring. And although I'm not there very often, a few days a month at best, during like peak pandemic, I was there every day that we were open. And because we had, limited capacity and limited hours, I was able to do that, no problem. But I wasn't traveling. I wasn't out on the road teaching. And so I was witnessing this happen in real time. And it was mind blowing that you'd get people who'd say, oh no, you don't want moldavite. No, I got that. And then my girlfriend dumped me. And then, my parents grounded me and failing all my classes. And, they list all these things. And the way you just interjected yourself into this conversation and this girl didn't ask you, is it really the moldavite or are you just kind of an asshole? Because I'm gathering it's the latter and you're just looking for an excuse. And now you can blame it on the moldavite. But, so much of this craze was owed to correlation without causation, because the thing about stones, the thing about working with a rock, a mineral, a fossil, a gem, is that you work with it. It doesn't fix your life for you. I think of crystals as catalysts. Catalysts are, we'll say, substances that lower the amount of effort or energy required to achieve an outcome. So like the enzymes in your digestive tracts are catalysts because we don't have to mechanically break down all the food. We still do, but the chemicals take over for us, and our body does that. So crystals are kind of spiritual catalysts. It's like the difference between, working out with free weights at home and going to the gym that has all the fancy equipment that is specialized and targets specific muscle groups. You can do it without that. But if you do it with that, you're likely to see progress better, faster, sooner, and more effectively. But you have to show up to the gym. If I buy the piece of moldavite and I don't do anything with it, what is changing in my life? Like, none of us were immune to what was going on in 2020 and 2021 and so on. So how much of that is really the stone? Because if you're not sitting in there and sitting down with it and meditating and doing the healing work or doing the ritual or doing the spellcraft with it, how are you really inviting moldavite to shape your life? And so I think it is a really magical stone, but it definitely doesn't live up to the things erroneously attributed to it, because most of these voices weren't doing anything with their moldavite except maybe wearing it unconsciously.
Yeah. It were wild, wasn't it? I remember going to a really impressive crystal and fossil shop and looking at these moldavites. It must have been like 22, maybe 23. And the guy who had the shop was saying to me, oh, you want to be careful with that.
And, that's not to discount the wonderful experiences that people do have with it. And that, there are some stones that have, we'll say, they work at a faster speed than some others. We can say the true of plant spirits and other allies that we work with in magic. If you work with the baneful plants, they tend to work more quickly than your sage, your rosemary, your lavender. But that doesn't mean that sage and rosemary and lavender are not effective allies. It also doesn't mean that like mandrake or henbane is the answer to everything. We use the right tool for the right circumstance. And moldavite is the right tool in some circumstances. But flint might be a better choice other times, or rose quartz, or labradorite. And being well-rounded is much better than not.
Have you got a large crystal collection? Dare I ask how many you own?
I think the nicest way I can put it is I genuinely don't know how many I own. I'm more than 30 years I've been collecting, not like rocks and fossils I picked up in my childhood, earlier than that, but like my mineral collection starts about 31, almost 32 years ago now, when I got that first piece of quartz. And maybe there'll be periods where a couple weeks or a month goes by where I don't get a new rock, but then also I'll go away to a show or help the occult shop I work for do some sourcing at a trade show, and I'm there and everything is wholesale, and so I may as well just get a few things that I don't have in my collection, or I just really liked this piece of jewelry. It doesn't matter that I have 6 other Petersite pendants. I liked this one. I have a lot of rocks, but I come back to some core allies on a daily basis, and these days a good excuse for buying new rocks is getting a more photogenic piece than I currently own, because writing books about crystals, it's helpful to have illustrations of them in there. And when the witching stones came out, they came up with the clever idea to keep the printing costs down, to put them right inside the front and back cover. And you've got to have like hundreds and hundreds of pictures, and it makes them heavy on that paper, but it also makes them expensive. I do tend to treat myself if I can come up with the idea of working a new stone into a book. So I might have gotten some new toadstones and some new amber and some new jet for the witching stones. There's really nice pictures, and I am glad to have a nice collection, but also every now and then I think about how the next time I have to move, it's going to be miserable, because the last time I moved, it was bad, but now I have more. And the same is true of my books, by the way. Every time I move, it's like, oh gosh, I have to pack all these up. So hopefully I won't be doing that for a nice long time, but it's an inevitable part of human life.
Did you mention that you're a Reiki practitioner? Do you use your stones in your Reiki then?
Not really. Not very often, at least. There's a couple exceptions, but I'm a staunch traditionalist. I respect innovation. I write about innovation. I map out how things evolve and change and progress over time in the Reiki community. I don't have academic credentials, but I try to bring academic rigor to the kind of research that I do. So the idea of like laying on of stones on someone during treatment in Reiki practice is a fairly, as we practice it today, is a fairly modern innovation. And I appreciate a more historically informed approach to practice. I also like keeping it simple, because then I can just show up and I am the tool. I am the vessel. I don't have to cart around a heavy box of rocks anytime I want to practice Reiki. There are a couple of interesting historical intersections. I'm actually writing a book about Reiki right now. It'll be my second book on the topic. And I'm not entirely sure when it'll come out, because I'm not entirely sure when I'm going to finish writing it, but probably it'll be out sometime 2027. And there's one chapter in there that is kind of devoted to the intersection of these two practices, because it does appear to have some anecdotal evidence of going back to the 1920s in one specific way. And then by the 1930s, there's a second specific way that might happen. And then independently, later on in Reiki history, people start combining crystals and Reiki organically. And I'm using those historic footnotes in Reiki's history as justification for why it makes sense that so many people would be drawn to combining these practices. And of course, writing about a thing means that I do the thing. So I did steep myself in that kind of intersection for a kind of renewed interest. Earlier in my Reiki practice, I combined them very freely. I started with a very westernized, very modern approach, which I love and respect and value, and have many peers and colleagues who prefer, and students who prefer that style of practice. And I'm here to endorse that style, but also to say, mine doesn't look like that. But tell me about yours. When someone else's practice, whether it's Reiki, crystals, witchcraft, whatever, when someone else's practice looks different to mine, my first instinct is not, oh, they're wrong. It's quite the opposite. It is, oh, I suddenly get very curious. Show me what you do. Write the symbol the way you write it, or show me how you compose this thing, or demonstrate this for me if you'd like to. And let's talk about how you learned it and who they learned it from, and so on and so forth, because I love seeing how things change over time. And it's really enriching to do that. One of my big goals in life, whatever I'm studying, whatever I'm doing, is always to seek contrary evidence. No practice, no system, no person is all right or all wrong all of the time. It's usually some mix somewhere in the middle. It's all gray area in the practical sense. I don't personally do a lot of combining. I teach a couple techniques, some of which are more historically rooted, but definitely it is a popular thing to combine them pretty freely.
Yeah, I think we've got a bit of an exclusive there as well. You're writing another book.
Yeah, so this is book number 12. So The Witching Stones is book number 10, just out now. And then I have another book on crystals that I co-wrote with one of my dear friends and colleagues, Devin Hunter. He's also a prolific writer. So we have a book on crystal divination coming out in the springtime. And then hopefully shortly after that book comes out, I will have finished the manuscript for this new work that I'm engaging with. And then I have book 13 planned already. I have a very basic sketch of the outline for it. It will involve new research. All I'm going to say is that if you look at the body of my work and look at the topics that I engage with, you probably will not expect this book.
Oh, bloody hell.
It will not closely resemble the other things that I do. And that's exciting. I've hinted with a publisher who's already interested in that one in particular. And it's I don't want to say it out loud entirely, but it seems like they were reading between the lines. They're like, you're going to send that to us, right? I'm like, we'll talk. I haven't written it yet. I haven't started it. But with any luck, I will continue writing until I can no longer stare at a screen.
Oh my God, that's like a Bell Witch exclusive. I love them. No, like you say, with the Reiki, it is interesting. I do Reiki too. And I do use a really large clear quartz. But I think that's just because I inherited it off my mum, and she loved it and she used it with her tarot and stuff. So in my mind's eye, I can see it and feel it enhancing the Reiki. And that's all I use, really. I don't do the whole putting them on you. I mean, if anything, it's hard to make them stay.
Yes.
Roll off and crack on the floor and you're like, oh.
It's true that the practical bit is such an important bit to consider as well. And it's funny that quartz is the only one that you're drawn to for this, because historically, the founder of the practice, we have some anecdotal evidence. We don't have a whole lot of good detailed written records from that period because Reiki was taught by oral transmission predominantly. And there is a tradition that has been published about, but maybe not examined in super great depth that the founder of the practice of Reiki, Usumikao, used to perform Deiju, which is like the prototype of the modern day initiation or attunement. So that's what he called that ritual. But he would give Deiju to clear quartz spheres. And then these could be sent off to someone who was unable to see a practitioner on a regular basis. So they could just place that sphere and it would radiate Reiki the same as a practitioner's hands. And one of the things that I talk about in this chapter of the book is the reason that it's so specifically clear quartz and a spherical shape, I think is an interesting kind of rebus in Japanese language that links some distantly related concepts from like thousands of years ago. And it's the idea that the word for soul, often pronounced tama in Japanese, in classical Japanese, when Chinese characters were first brought to Japan and were first used to systematically write out the language, they chose to group the written characters with their spoken language based solely on pronunciation in the beginning. And so they picked several words that made the sound tama, but didn't necessarily explicitly mean soul in all instances. So you've got the word for spirit, the word for soul. You also have the word for jewel or gemstone, and then the word that means sphere or bead. And they were all used to write the word soul. So usually we perform Reiju to living beings who have souls, but also we can perform them on quartz to charge them up, because linguistically it's like this little pun. I'm tapping into the soul of the stone, and therefore it can carry this Reiki, this soul or spirit energy. And I suspect that may be the reason the prescription was so narrow on it being clear quartz and being a sphere. But also Japan has a long history of immensely high quality crystal spheres, so that may also be part of it. It was accessible then, and so they did it, as opposed to other gemstones, which were probably a lot less accessible.
Nice. Well, I'm aware we're coming up to 55 minutes, which is mad. It's unbelievable. I haven't asked anything I was going to ask, which is usually how it goes. And you said you got your fossil from Yorkshire. Where was it in Yorkshire?
From Port Mulgrave in Whitby. So this is Dactylioceras. So this is one of the more common varieties of ammonite from that area. But Whitby is like so entrenched in ammonite history and myth and magic. We've got the legendary story behind the building of the abbey. We've got St. Hilda, who is the first abbess and the founder of Whitby Abbey. Allegedly, the ground was so overrun with snakes that by the virtue and magic of her prayers alone, the snakes were petrified, coiled up, and began to, she'd whip them, and they rolled down the cliffs. And that's why we find these snake stones, these coiled serpents embedded in rock there today. As a result, another common species that you find in parts of England has been named in her honor, Hildoceras, which means the horn of St. Hilda. Knights are sometimes known as serpent stones, but are also known as horn stones because they look like the coiled horns of a ram. They're so iconic in Whitby, and the Yorkshire coast is such a great place to do fossil hunting, whether you're looking for ammonites or you want to find jet. Whitby jet is famous worldwide, was traded throughout the entire Roman Empire. We find jet from the Yorkshire coast in places like Austria and Germany and other parts of mainland Europe because the Romans prized it so much that they traded it back and forth. So that little part of the world is filled with a lot of magical stones.
Like you say, the jet kind of overshadows all the other stuff, like the snake stones. It's all about the jet in Whitby today, everywhere.
For sure, yeah. Jet is also a magical rock. I actually have some Whitby jet right here as well.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, it's right light, isn't it? It feels like it should be heavy.
Magical rock.
But there's a chapter in the book about that as well.
Exactly, yeah. Amber and jet, because they were really thought to be two varieties of the same substance for so much of human history. It's not really until the 19th century, which is not that long ago, that we figure out they're not quite identical, but they have similar kind of origins. They both come from trees, just under different circumstances, but they both float in salt water. They're both flammable. These kinds of features led people to believe that they were deeply related. And so trying to write a chapter about, initially I was thinking I was going to write a chapter on amber and a chapter on jet. And then I thought, well, but like the most iconic use of them among witches today is together. So which one's going to come first? Which chapter will be second? But when you look at their like material use throughout history, they're so intertwined. They fulfill such similar functions. It just made sense to kind of slap them together into one chapter. And so that's what I did.
Where can my listeners find you?
I am online as The Luminous Pearl. So that's theluminouspearl.com, at The Luminous Pearl on most social media.
And you work in a gemstone shop?
I do that a couple days a month. I also have a job in academia. I work in earth science and collections management for the Gillespie Museum, which is home to the largest mineral collection in the southeastern United States. And I'm doing curatorial work, cataloging and building a database, and doing triage on specimens that have not been properly stored, and all kinds of things like that. I get to live my inner scientist dream when I'm there, and then elsewhere I get to put on my occult hat. And it's fun that I get to see this subject matter through so many different lenses.
You're living the gemstone dream life here.
For sure.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Nicholas. It's been an absolute blast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You have been listening to the Bell Witch Podcast, an independent podcast created and produced with love and magic by me, Swailes, the Friendly Green Witch. Big thank you to our amazing Moot Loot guest, and thank you to you, dear listener, for choosing the Bell Witch Podcast to fill your ears. Simple and effective ways you can support the podcast is by leaving ratings and reviews wherever you listen to your shows, as those stars really do help the show to shine, increasing the reach and helping download numbers. You can subscribe to the Bell Witch Podcast on Patreon, where you will receive ad-free early access episodes, behind-the-scene interview videos, poetry competitions, and Cauldron of Woo exclusive podcast episodes every month. You can get in contact with me via email at thebellwitchpodcast@yahoo.com and follow me on Instagram, The Bell Witch Podcast, separated by underscores. I love to support and connect other independent witchy businesses and spiritual practitioners. So if you would like to come on to the Bell Witch Podcast or do a magical trailer swap, please feel free to contact me. Music by Jeff Harvey on Pixabay. Photography is by the lovely Beverly Thornton. I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this episode. Stay magical, witches!